he's here, we can start. All right, hi Dave.
Hiya.
I'm waiting.
Yeah, has been. And this is advanced world building.
This is World Building 201.
Right. So this is beyond the how do you set up your world and how do you make it, realistic or unrealistic if that's your goal. It's going kind of deeper into storytelling, game design. But is there anyone here interested in the game aspects?
I mean, both.
Both? Everyone's in for both. So I don't know if you've done.
I don't have any professional experience in that area. No,
I don't have professional experience in it, but I've been gaming since '79. So we can, but we may not have to isolate them because, like we were talking about earlier, they apply across the board. The same ideas and techniques can apply.
A world is a world. Build it as you choose. If you build it, they will come.
Right? Exactly. So maybe we should introduce ourselves.
Okay.
It's more of an Oricon thing, but
yeah. Okay, so I'm David D. Levine. I'm a Hugo and Nebula winning science fiction writer. I have 3 novels and over 50 short stories out there, and world building is my jam.
Okay. I'm Kamila Miller. I write as E.M. Praisman, and I've written about 8 novels and have about 3 or 4 short stories published professionally, and then a few in fan-based anthologies. So we're kind of reverse. You are the great short story writer, and your novels are great too.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm not a fast writer, but for most of my career, I was writing and selling about 4 short stories a year, and it adds up. I still think of myself as a newer writer, even though I've been at it for 22 years now. Something between 20 and 24 years.
And I think that's because you and I both have we're always learning, and you always feel like you're trying to get to this point, regardless of where you are in your writing career, writing techniques, stages, things like that. It's like, I still have so much to learn before I get this dialed in. Yeah,
the thing about that, I was actually talking about this in another panel earlier today, that the thing about the whole try-fail cycle is that after you try, fail, eventually you succeed. And once you've succeeded, once you've unlocked the door swings open, and you discover there's a whole dungeon beyond it. All successes reveal additional problems hiding behind them.
So I have sort of a plan. I don't know if you have a plan.
Please do.
Okay. So what I want to talk about is that whatever you design with your world, the economic systems, politics, the landscape, things like that. You're usually creating a playground and then you let people run around with it. When you go to the next level, you're actually designing your world to act upon the characters in some way and put it, in some cases, or maybe most cases, into motion. So for example, with politics, often the trope will be, we've got these 2 groups at war, and they hate each other, and they're coming at each other. So if you're making it more dynamic, you won't have it, that's not black and white. You say, this problem, this pressure has been applied, and now you've got zealots, you've got terrorists, you've got conscription groups, you've potentially got protests and riots, you've got refugees, you've got insurrections, you've got coups, and you don't have to lay those all out in the beginning, because it's complicated. I mean, that's some people's jam, to just set this all up in advance, and they've got all the notes, and they've basically written a world book at that point.
Yeah, the real world is complicated.
Right.
But probably the real world is more complicated than you need your fictional world to be.
But what you can do is you can say, the war hasn't started yet, but there's these mutterings over here, and that's what your characters interact with. Or there's a conscription group for a war that's way far away, but they're starting to go further afield to gather their soldiers, and so suddenly you're conked in the head and dragged off, and suddenly you're part of this.
And whether you're writing fiction or setting up a game scenario, when you create something that those offstage mutterings, then you're probably going to be in a position to actually bring those mutterings on stage at some point. Now, if what you're doing is you're writing a game scenario for other people to implement, to actually to game in, then you would probably want to set that up as some kind of scenario, either as a hint or an explicit script for the game master, depending on how you're running it. Or if you're writing fiction, then that would be something that you would want to put on stage to hint that something is going to be happening soon, either in this book or perhaps in some subsequent book. So sometimes you put things in just for texture, and sometimes you put them in as a deliberate setup for something that's coming. And what I find as a fiction writer is that very often when I'm writing the climax, I'm reaching, I mean, I knew when I wrote the outline that at the climax, the main character would pull something out of their hat and save the day. And when I wrote the outline, I had no idea what it would be. I knew it had to be something. And then when I actually come to write that scene, I discover that some pointless little detailed background that I've thrown in some earlier chapter just for color is exactly the thing that I need. It's really kind of amazing how frequently it happens. And I don't know whether it's my subconscious being smart enough to know that it needs to plant something that it's going to need later on, or more likely my subconscious has been chewing over that little detail that I put in and recognizing how it fits in with the world and saying, hey, I can use that. So you got to trust the process, and this is one reason to write your book in order from beginning to end. But once you've finished it, of course, then you have the ability to go back to the beginning and make everything seem tidy. And you can write in an incredibly chaotic and sloppy way, and then once you've finished it, you may wish to go back and put in foreshadowing, put in hints that things are going to be happening. Place that gun on that. If somebody whips a gun out of nowhere in the climax of your first draft and shoots somebody, then in the editing phase, that's when you go back and place the gun on the mantelpiece. So that's why fiction makes sense and real life does not.
Yeah.
Because you can always go back and make it have been that way from the beginning.
Yeah, I like what you said about trusting the process, because when you go into advanced world building, sometimes you will have elements that are considered unchangeable and you realize that actually they're actionable. Maybe we should talk about what's inevitable versus what's changeable. So something that's inevitable, an example would be winter is coming. Winter is going to come. There's nothing that the characters can do to stop winter from coming. So in that situation, they're in survival or mitigation mode. They're going to have to figure out some ways to get around and not die during winter. Actionable elements are things that you can change. So in Shakespeare's courtyard scene with the War of the Roses beginning, each character chooses which color rose to pluck, the red or the white, to choose which side of the War of the Roses on. And the War of the Roses might not even happen if everyone plucks a white rose. So that's an actionable political situation.
And in some cases, your hands are tied because of existing published material. Whether you're writing fanfic, whether you're writing a sequel, whether you're writing in an established universe, there may be things that have already been established which you mess with at your peril. Does not to say you can never mess with it, but you have to do so in a thoughtful way. And there's other stuff that you may, for example, find yourself wanting to do something that you had always said you would never do, but if you never, if you said this, if you said to yourself as you were writing it, this is not going to be a time travel novel. I'm never going to have time travel. And you find yourself writing a place where time travel would sure be not only useful but plausible, then you have to go, well, I never actually promised in public that I wouldn't have time travel. So you can break your own rules, and you can break your own rules if you feel it's necessary. You can break other people's rules if you can really justify it. But the bigger the precedent, the harder, the bigger the precedent, the more important the effect has to be to justify it.
Right. So, you can take something that's actionable and make it unchangeable, unmitigatable, or not, and then you can take something that is malleable and set it in stone. But like David said, at your peril, depending on how well you've established that. Because having winter not come after saying winter is coming would have been, it would have undone a lot of the ticking time clock and danger elements, and it would have been a huge letdown, honestly.
Well, what did we get? A huge letdown.
Yeah.
So even though winter did come, so it's all in the details. It's all in the implementation. You can have the best possible idea, and I am sorry. I need to rant on this. Everybody is. I am 1 week behind on watching Discovery, so I've seen the second to last episode, but not the last episode of season 4. And in this episode, they keep saying, in 15 hours, both Earth and Vulcan will be destroyed, and yet the episode has no momentum, no acceleration, no sense of urgency to it. You've got people taking 5 minutes to go off into another room and talk about, my girlfriend was a little bit cross with me. I mean, never mind that she's the president of a planet that's about to be destroyed. It's like, do you really have 5 minutes to talk about this in the middle of this situation? And apparently they felt they did, which means that the characters are obviously feeling no urgency. So there's just no sense of urgency and very low stakes, despite the fact that textually they'd done everything to set up the stakes to be really high. So that was just an incredibly boring episode for the second to last episode of a season of Star Trek I've ever seen.
So yeah, you have to, if you have something that is dire and imminent in your setting, it needs to be dire and imminent enough.
The characters need to feel it, is what I'm saying.
Right. In a world I'm working on right now, they're on a strict time clock. And time clocks are great for, you can get used to them, like every 30 seconds there's going, or not every 30 seconds. In the Hunger Games, every hour the clock changes and a disaster happens in this wedge. So they get used to it and they beat the clock, right? And the writer brings in other things, other elements to increase the danger and throw them off again. But that time clock is always present, and in the back of your mind you're going, what wedge are we in? Are we in the wedge where the disaster happens, and is it one we've experienced and can manage, or is it like instant death like the wall of water?
Right, and of course the game masters in Hunger Games can and do choose to change the rules arbitrarily.
Right.
Yeah, and as author, you have the right to change the rules arbitrarily, but it needs to be done mindfully
within a system.
Yeah.
So, I want to go over some. I already mentioned some political things that you can do, political forces. Unfortunately, we have the Ukraine situation unveiling right now, which you can use as a study. And being a writer or a game master, it can feel at times like you're being a bit of a vulture. It's easier when it's a historical event that you're picking apart and using for when it's unveiling, in real time with real people suffering. Well, it's always been real people suffering, but
But
real people suffering.
if they're 100 years dead, there's nothing to be done about it.
Right, but you'll feel a bit like a vulture, but at the same time, what are we doing as writers and game masters? We're expressing the human experience. And
well, and your job as writer or game master is to make your characters' lives hell. Characters who have pleasant lives do not make for interesting stories.
Right.
Okay. So, the standard advice is, in Act 1 you put the sheriff in a tree. In Act 2 you throw rocks at him. That the idea is that you need your obligation as the master of your character's world is to make them absolutely miserable. because miserable characters have a strong motivation to do something, and motivated characters are interesting to watch.
Yes. So you can employ things that you wouldn't normally think of in a story or a game, like even if the war is way over here and doesn't affect your characters directly because you don't want to tell a war story, and that is fair. You can say, well, suddenly our little town is booming because we're an iron town and they need iron. Or suddenly we're not getting the wheat shipment that we're used to, and now we're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example of world building 201. Is world building 101, you have a war and you have your characters get involved in the war. World building 201 is there's a war over there and your characters are dealing with refugees, they're dealing with resource shortages, they're dealing with transportation infrastructure problems, that you get into those second and third order effects. You look at the consequences of the world, not just building the world, but actually looking at the consequences of decisions that you've already made and really following them through. And then world building 301 is not only do you have resource shortages because of the war that's happening over there, but you also have politicking within the local economy about who gets to make money off of the short resources. You know, so now you have social effects based on side effects of the thing that's actually happening. And the more of these levels that you can pack in, the more lifelike your situation will appear, the more true to life, because real life is messy. The risk there, of course, is that you either spend so much of your own time and resources or so many words on the page in describing this complicated situation that the actual thrust of the story becomes lost.
It has to directly relate to the characters. You can have it all built up in the background to make it interesting. They may not be aware that, oh, our town is booming with, and suddenly people are buying steel, but they may not be aware it's because of a war. There's just a sudden demand, and they don't know why, especially if communication is poor. Or if there are multiple wars and they don't know who it is who's doing the buying. Which takes me to economics. A lot of people don't think about that magic and magic systems have an economic system to them, and some of the best stories and games have situations where magic is decreasing, and so it's now more valuable, and people who use magic are kind of struggling and trying to find ways to get their magic back because nobody likes to lose resources or lose their strength or lose their health or lose anything, and so they struggle to maintain kind of a normal for them. You can also increase magic, and suddenly it's everywhere and dangerous. That was great in the Wild Magic series, where suddenly it's everywhere and it's hard to cope with.
Yeah, and one thing about we always use the term magic systems, and especially here at GameStorm, I'm sure that there's a lot of people who think when you think about magic, you think, okay, what are the rules, what are the resources, you know, where does it work, where does it not work, and a lot of writers will say, I hate magic systems. You know, a lot of writers say, I want magic to be magical, not just a technology with different rules. You know, the many magic systems, especially in gaming, where obviously you have to codify it in such a way that the players and GMs can work together to have outcomes that they all agree on. They are systems with rules and equations and perhaps there are dice involved. But I think that if you take a step away from that idea, which pervades modern fantasy as well as fantasy gaming, if you take a step away from that idea and look how magic has worked in real history, you know, what people call magic, that magic is numinous. It is vague and inconsistent, and the more weird it feels, the more unconventional, unpredictable, the more it feels like something that is truly magical, truly something that can take you into a fantastic, in the other sense of the word, an unusual, a weird, a peculiar state of being, state of mind. So if that's what you're trying to achieve in your fiction, then having a magic system that could be implemented with dice is probably not what you want to do. You know, you want to have your magic be based on something that's more ethereal, something you know that. I mean, you look at the things that have been called magical in real human history. It all depends on the the whims of the gods, or it has. I mean, magical realism. You know, the magic in a magical realist story is not something that you could codify with dice at all. It is just shit happens. And sometimes the shit makes some kind of sense, and sometimes it doesn't make some kind of sense. At least it doesn't appear to at first. So when you're building your world, you do have the choice of not actually following through and knowing what all the rules are. Maybe there are no rules. Maybe shit just happens. As long as it functions in the sense of creating an entertaining fiction, as long as it works the way you as creator want it to work, then that's fine. Now, I wouldn't recommend this for a role-playing game, but in prose fiction, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
it's-
definitely
There's
definitely
ways
a
to do it in
valid
role-playing
tactic.
games, though.
I'm sorry?
There are ways to do it in role-playing games, though.
Yeah, but it requires the GM to have some kind of justification instead of the dice.
So doing that is an advanced technique in the sense that you have to trust your intuition. Since you don't have a kind of codified set of rules, you have to trust that this isn't going to blow up on me and start to not make sense, which is fair to do. Like people who don't outline their books, or people who outline their books but feel free to deviate from the outline when they realize, oh, this is actually much better over here. We have all been raised to be storytellers, in a sense that we learn how to transmit our experiences and accept the experiences of others through the storytelling medium, and making up fantastical stories. We know underlying when it's right, when it feels right. And it's okay to, go ahead and follow your gut.
Yeah, the telling of stories is how our brains work. It's how we tell stories in order to make sense of the universe. The thing is that sometimes the universe doesn't actually make sense. So that tension between our stories and the weirdness of the universe is that's the realm of spirituality and philosophy. And you can absolutely play with that in a world building 201 sort of thing, of having there be tension between the character's understanding of the world and the weird shit that the world actually does.
So, so we're basically expanding on the original idea of, or how to implement the idea of your magic, your economics, your politics, or anything, instead of being a set thing in a world that you have designed. Go ahead and let it be in flux. Tolkien's famously thought of it having a world that is like a character, that is changing and growing and has its own arc. And you can do that too. You don't have to necessarily, if it doesn't make sense in your head that your world is a character that I'm going to send through this story arc, then don't do that. It's a great tool, but just, you can, without using that tool, you can still go, well, this isn't a world that's static. This is a world with seasons and weather, and that these are going to act upon the characters and drive the story in their own way. Which weather, I don't see it too much in games or stories, but boy, those disaster movies, I just love them, love them. Where the antagonist is a storm or earthquakes, or and those are great, and not employed as much in fiction and games as one might perhaps. Yeah. There's opportunities there.
Let me introduce the concept of the pathetic fallacy, which is neither pathetic nor a fallacy. The pathetic fallacy is the use of aspects of the setting in order to express and reinforce the character's emotions. When your character who is character's mother has died and he cannot cry, and he stands at the window and watches the rain come down. That's the pathetic fallacy in action. The rain expresses emotions that the character does not. The rain can also, the weather or aspects of the world can also be used to create a mood, not necessarily the character's current emotion, but the emotion that you want the reader to have. If you're setting a story in a creepy old castle with mold and spider webs, and that creates a certain emotional expectation in the reader, and the reader also will see that setting and expect a certain kind of story. And then when you have used the setting to create that expectation in the reader's mind, you can now either run with that or you can upend it. And there's no end of ways that you can use setting to create mood. I mean, imagine instead of a creepy old castle, it was a hideously sterile hospital, or an incredibly high-tech skyscraper, or a mountain fastness, or a space station. Each of these creates a mood, creates expectation in the reader's mind, and acts as a constraint on the characters. If the characters are all in some kind of mountain fastness, well, that creates the constraint that they're not going to be able to leave easily, or there may not be a lot of food available, or they may be having trouble breathing because they're so high. There are, in the mountain fastness, you may have the hazard of wolves, which is less likely to occur in the sterile hospital. So this setting
I don't know,
creates.
if there's mutant wolves in the basement to make it out.
Anything is possible. This is fiction. You're in control. But the thing is that the setting places constraints upon the characters. The setting places certain obstacles. Basically places them on the game board, and you may choose to use them, or you may not. But it certainly, if the characters are in a hospital and they're in trouble, they're not going to spend any time thinking about, okay, but what do we do if wolves attack? Whereas if they're in a mountain fastness, that is something that they need to worry about, and the reader will be aware of that too. So you've got to follow through on the implications of the decisions that you have made.
Absolutely. Well-designed settings don't just create a mood and expectations, but they create opportunities. Whenever you limit yourself to poetry form or to a setting or anything like that, sometimes you feel like I have to be true to this, I have to be true to this, I have to transmit this, but you instead can start looking for, how can I use this? What are the cool things about the setting? Why did I pick this setting? What makes it great?
And what could make it even better?
And what could make it even better? Yeah, let's
Yeah.
double down.
Yeah.
Let's dial it to 11.
Yeah, I had a scene in the first Arabella book where Arabella had been imprisoned in the hold, and she manages to break out, and she has to creep under the bottom of the ship to try to rescue her other shipmates. And I thought, this is a pretty good scene, but it could be better. So I had it be a storm. So suddenly all of her difficulties of breaking out of the hold and creeping along the underside of the ship and then hauling herself up the anchor chain and leaping onto the deck. Okay, now everything's wet, everything's dark, it's cold and it's miserable, and there's lightning, and it just made the whole thing just ever so much more exciting by, again, places constraints on the characters and offers the option, puts more hazards on the table. So in this case, the hazard of being struck by lightning is suddenly an issue.
Whether it's a story or a game, you can also use the environment as kind of a maze. So sometimes people say, my character isn't doing what I want them to do. They are not making the choices that I want them to make. And if I can't make them have other choices because then it's out of character. Well, if you don't want to change the character, apply pressure. Believe me, if somebody does not want a baby, never wanted a baby, does not want to have anything to do in infants, but you're in a disaster, and there is a baby lying on the ground, that character is going to pick up and protect that baby, and now they have a baby. Congratulations.
Or if they don't, it tells you something about the character.
Yeah, then it tells you that maybe your character is, yeah, it tells you something about the character. And you can keep offering the babies throughout the story until they finally pick it up. They're turned in traffic or whatever, this disaster is happening, they have to go back, and it's the same baby, and now there's a menacing dog that's pulling at it, and it's like, oh, come on, just pick up the baby. But the point is you can use the environment to force your characters to make the choices that, it gets to a point where it's not workable. It's, you realize this story is not workable with this character and this setting, and the plans that I have made are just not working. I'm going to have to go a different way. But there is the option of using the environment, and this is in games too. It's like, I really want them to go to the volcano hideout and meet the mastermind and save the world. You can use the environment, use your setting to pressure them, and the only way to do that is if you have a dynamic setting in motion where you have things that you can throw at them. If you've got just, a nice little farming community and nothing is going on, and the Duke is really nice and he takes care of his people and stuff like that, they can wander around endlessly growing wheat. And never do what you need them to do.
If the character needs to get away, steal their car. And of course, when in doubt, send in a man with a gun.
Yep.
Or an octopus with a hatchet or something. Yeah.
I love it where it used to be, well, people didn't have phones, they can't call for help. Now you as a writer say everybody has phones, so you have to take out the service or break the phone.
Yeah, cell phones destroy plot. This is why I think we're seeing a lot of stuff that's set in the 70s. Is people are trying to write stories without having to deal with the fact that just about any problem can be solved by having somebody communicate with somebody else. So if everybody has cell phones, an awful lot of things that we used to have entire novels based upon just go away. The problem just goes away.
Right. But in world settings and world building, you can think outside the box and make things more difficult without taking away a phone. You can go, they can just call for help, but what if the help that comes is not the help they need?
Yeah. I mean, think about how many stories you've read in which we can't go to the cops because.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's in a lot of ways, because that's been done so much more interesting. They call the cops, but someone intercepted the call and arrives ahead of time, or instead, I don't remember what story it was, but I remember I was horribly shocked when the police showed up, but the bad guys did too, and blew the police away. And now you've got dead cops, and you've got the person in even more trouble, and the stakes are clearly higher. You thought, these people are bad enough, they're probably going to kill me. Now they're like, no, they're shot cops, they are going to kill me.
Yeah.
No more questions, no more beating around the bush.
Not to mention the fact that if more cops show up, they're going to see me with all these bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So now I can't go to the cops because the cops are looking for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a scene at the end of a recent movie, I'm not going to say which movie it is, where the main character has escaped from the bad guys, and he's driving along and he's getting away. It's right at the end of the movie, and then he sees red and white flashing lights, red and blue flashing lights in the mirror. He pulls over, and is it like, oh thank God it's the cops, or is the cop actually part of the conspiracy? And the interesting thing is that the director actually shot and released a version where the cop was part of the conspiracy and the main character died right at the end of the movie. And this was considered unsatisfactory by test audiences, so they changed the ending so that the cop was actually a friend. So as writer, this is under your control, and you may get feedback in the writing and revision process that the choice that you made is not satisfying, and therefore you can go back and rechange it.
Yep. Beta readers are valuable for that sort of stuff. Which, speaking of characters, in the gaming world, they're NPCs, but as fiction writers, a lot of people forget that, in a way, the characters that don't have speaking lines or whatever, or may have a few speaking lines but otherwise don't interact with the characters, are really part of the setting. And that you can, I think there's a lot of people concerned about diversity and representation in their books, and I think they overcomplicate it. Really, all you need to have diversity is not just different skin colors, but different cultures interacting, different ways of making money, different ways of living, different ways of communicating with each other, not just linguistically, but socially interacting. You can have your people be part of your setting, but expressing diversity of the human experience in ways that a lot of us who live in cities or just live in rural areas, and we have these singular experiences and kind of think the whole world is like that, without thinking, well, wait a minute, my cities don't have to look like these cities, and my cities can have these different groups of people, and they can get along, or they can not get along, or they can sometimes get along and other times not get along, and you will have instantly a sense of tension, especially if there's like nomadic peoples with their tents and things living on the in parts of the city where it causes stress on the people who are in solid stone buildings and think that the people living in tents and things are kind of a mess. And
I use the analogy of sets and props a lot. If you're writing a play, then you'll have the set, the walls and the lighting and various pieces of furniture, and then you have props, which are things that are hand carried. In creating your world, in equipping your characters, the characters will interact with the sets and the props, and the sets and the props the characters can affect the sets and props, and they are affected by them. So your set creates the mood, creates constraints on the character. The details of the set will tell the reader what time and place this is. Is this 18? Is this a gas lamp fantasy, or are they arc lights, or is it fluorescent light, or is it bioluminescence? All of these aspects of the set choose to inform the reader where and when this takes place, and creates expectations about what kind of story this is going to be. And then the props, the hand-carried items, these are things that characterize an individual. If somebody pulls out a gold cigarette lighter, well, it tells you something about the time and place. It's going to be sometime probably in the 19th, 20th centuries, because before then there were no cigarettes, and after then cigarettes were no longer really something that was in the zeitgeist. The fact that it's a gold cigarette lighter indicates that this is a person who either has money or has had money in the past, or perhaps their family has had money. The fact that the person is carrying a cigarette lighter tells you that they're a smoker. It gives you some information about, again, what time and place this is, and tells you something about this person. If a person in 2020 chooses to smoke, that is a very different character statement than if it's 1940. Okay? So just by flicking that gold cigarette lighter, you have said so many things about the place, about the character, and then once that cigarette lighter is in the character's hand, now, does he flick it nervously? Does he fiddle with it? Does he accidentally drop it and perhaps lose it? And now suddenly he has a temporary perhaps goal of, oh my God, that's my father's gold cigarette lighter. I cannot lose that. The cigarette lighter can become a nexus of all kinds of information. Can turn into a plot item. Can be used as a gift. Can be used as a weapon. And then then you get into details about, is it worn, is it scuffed, is it scarred, does it have a place where it used to have gems and they've since been pried off? Why? Who did that? What became of the money? Is this the kind of gold cigarette lighter that somebody is hanging on to because it's a family heirloom, or is it a gold cigarette lighter that the person is hanging on to because they might need to pawn it at some point in the near future? There's all of this stuff can be conveyed by having that character bring out that lighter. Okay. And every possible item can be infused with detail. I mean, look at this ring. Okay, I have a gold ring on the third finger of my left hand. What does that tell you about me? What does that tell you about my culture? What can you guess from the fact that I have no jewelry other than this one gold ring on the third finger of my left hand? And if you are describing an alien culture or a made-up fantasy culture, then it's your responsibility as writer to insinuate in some fashion what that thing means. In this case, looking at me here, you can make some assumptions about me based on this ring. On the other hand, if you're writing about an alien culture, then you can say, oh, I knew he was married because he had a ring on his third finger. Well, now you know that marriage is a thing in this culture, and furthermore, that ring signifies that, which means that you can give a similar ring to another character, or you can have a character notice that somebody isn't wearing one, and now it is meaningful in a way that makes the reader feel smart. The readers love to be made to feel smart. And so you can set up clues and puzzles for the reader, which act kind of like enrichment activities for a caged animal. Helps the reader, keep the reader's mind engaged.
The readers are actually, in a lot of ways, caged animals, and
Yeah.
you do have to keep them entertained. You have to enrich their lives. If it's too much about the characters and not enough about the setting, it does feel kind of like you're being stuck in a room with this character and there's no way out, and no matter how much you like that character, you're kind of like, you said something that triggered something really important, that it was on the wider scope of, when you've got characters with wealth and characters not with wealth, the span can be really, really wide, like it is in today's society. It could probably get wider, but it would be hard to imagine where you have the ultra, ultra super rich and the ultra, ultra destitute poor who are starving out. You can also have that really narrowed, where the very privileged are not that much better off than the very, very poor. They suffer from the same diseases. Yeah, they live in fortresses, but the fortresses are rather small and cramped by today's standards and very cold and drafty. They also have rats in them.
Yeah.
They have access to better food, but if there's a famine, they may get a better share, but they are still also hungry.
And tiny differences can be really important to characters. It's often said that in academia the stakes are high. The fights are more vicious because the stakes are so small. It's like if the difference between getting the corner office and a non-corner office, or between getting a tenured position and a non-tenured position, these are actually comparatively small differences. The difference between the tenured and the non-tenured position, day to day, it's not that big. But when that is the only thing that matters in your world, people can fight viciously. And so it becomes a psychological, it becomes a sociological story. But you look at the characters in Jane Austen. These are characters who really want for nothing. I mean, the difference between the destitute women who must be required to go and live with the cousins, and the rich woman with whose husband has 10,000 a year. These are all still members of the aristocracy.
Correct.
Even the ones who are terribly off are still very well off by comparison with their servants. Okay, but the small differences between somebody with 10,000 a year and somebody with only 1,000 a year are huge in Jane Austen's world, and as a brilliant writer, she makes you care about those tiny differences.
Yeah. Going back to the idea of these things don't have to be static, they can be in flux. In Downton Abbey, beautifully, the setting is in major flux. The wealthy with these estates are bleeding money like crazy. And when I went to England and went through the house, it was a really wonderful for the Keira Knightley. It wasn't Pride and Prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
They were talking about because of the war and the taxes that they'd set up. When the patriarch died, there were so many taxes, they had to split up the estate and decide what to save and what not to save. They decided to save the house, which meant they had to send off droves of land, which means the house was no longer self-supporting from the income, and they had to come up with other means of income to run the house, had to lay off tons of servants. You have a similar thing in Downton Abbey where they're bleeding money, the estate's no longer paying for itself, and they're getting shoved from the aristocracy into a kind of middle class. Meanwhile, the working class can demand higher wages because they're in high demand, and they're being pushed up into the middle class. You can have this economic action in your settings too, where divides are being narrowed, or divides are spreading out like they are now, where the ultra-rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer.
Yeah, and then of course you have the collision between the nouveau riche and the old riche. They have, both of them may have money, but they're going to have very different attitudes toward money.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
And this is, this is also, I mean, we're just talking about stuff that exists in real history. If you have a good imagination, you can make up stuff that nobody's ever seen before. If you can make it plausible, then you can do really cool things with it.
Yeah. So just think about when you're doing, when you're taking your world building to the next level, having things in motion and in flux and being dynamic is always going to be more interesting than laying down the rules and then, having our characters run around in a static situation.
Mm-hmm. So we got 10 minutes to the hour. Are there any questions? Yes.
What, for each of you, what is a pitfall you've seen in someone else's world? Possibly a common pitfall, but something you've seen where you're like, that's horrible, this is what you need to fix about this world.
Ooh, I'm not prepared to answer that one.
Okay. Too much detail. Or rather, too much of the wrong detail. There are two ways that I've seen beginning manuscripts fall down in terms of setting. One is that it's called white room syndrome, that the characters are just interacting and you have no idea where this is taking place. Okay, that is a real beginner mistake, and it's pretty easy to fix. You just add some more detail. The other one, though, is for everything to be described in marvelous detail in such a way that it doesn't actually matter. You can talk about the pattern on the damask, and you can talk about exactly how many buttons she has on her collar, and you can talk about you can talk about the chandeliers, but once you've talked about the chandelier, adding details about the damask and the jeweled buttons and the numbers of servants is just gilding the lily. That you need to choose the telling detail. You need to describe the details that make this thing, this setting, this object, this character uniquely who they are, and get out. I personally have a tendency to say the same thing 2 or 3 times and then come back during revision and realize, I've just been repeating myself. I can take 2 of these out. And so you pick the best one, and maybe you fold the best 2 together into one. But you need to be careful to include the details that are necessary and distinct, and leave the rest to the reader's imagination. Because any creative work, any work of fiction, is a dance between the reader and the writer. The reader actually does most of the work.
I finally thought of one. Okay, so I don't remember the name of the movie, but it was one where you're on a spaceship and horrible things are happening and you're apparently plummeting towards a black hole, and you find out that the ship is actually going to hell. And at that point it went completely apart because you took a science fiction thing where you're expecting a science fiction explanation, and you wander off into fantasy. I think that they were
that
trying...
was literally The Black Hole. Disney's The Black Hole, 1978.
No, Disney didn't have a plot with hell. It was something like Vanishing Point.
Okay.
But But when you betray a promise with your setting and go off into a completely different trope or a different set of expectations, your readers will rebel. There will be always a few who go along for the ride and say, oh, that's kind of creative, that's kind of, but even with them, it will feel like a trick. You have tricked them. And most readers don't like to be tricked. So be clear about the type of setting that you're setting out and kind of stick to it. It's okay to have little surprises, but they have to kind of, you know, you can't have like a dune desert planet and then suddenly an ice storm blows through and people are like, how does that work?
And you can get away with weird shit like that if you set it up.
If you set it up correctly, you can have cold deserts for sure. But
Yeah. Well, and for example, you know, if you have your science fiction black hole story suddenly wind up literally in hell, you know, if you've got a character who really believes in that stuff and keeps talking about it, then when it actually happens, at least you tried to set it up. Whether or not it works, you know, may depend on the reader.
Or even if they don't like, or you could even go so far as to have a character that's a mystic, so they don't have to talk about it, but the fact that there are such things as mystics implies to the readers or the viewers or your gamers that therefore there are mystical things and that it makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, because there were no religious, you know, and it isn't even really a religion type thing when you have a spaceship going to hell. It's just, it was very, very badly done.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that movie really went to hell.
It really went to hell.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming. There is a follow-up
We're going to be doing a workshop.
workshop.
Right
Yeah.
after this. I have no idea what we're going to do, but we'll make it work.
Well, it depends on you guys. Where if nobody has brought a project that they want to hash out with everyone publicly, then we can like maybe set up a theoretical project and kind of build a world together.
Yeah. Or we could have it be a practicum. You know, talk about specific questions, and
Right.
we can work together on finding some answers.